warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. This is Sister Kathryn with the Islamic Outreach Center of Colorado. Today we're going to be doing the first in what will be a series, inshallah, of discussions around just the broad topic of Islam on the concept of sex and gender, kind of contrasted to the modern Western concept. And I want to kind of start at the beginning because there's so many other topics I want to get into, sex ed in the Islamic concept, gender roles as adults in the Islamic concept, fitra, teaching children about biology, things like this. So I felt like the best way to approach that was to kind of start at the beginning and go down the differences from start to finish. Obviously, in the modern context, any discussion around gender and the sexes, we have to first kind of clarify our terms, which you guys probably know by now. If you've been watching, I like to always do that. I like to be clear about what it is I mean when I say a word, because English can be a very vague, kind of obscure language, sometimes deliberately so. That's a great tool when you're trying to make your point without much substance. So these terms, gender and sex, as in sex, the noun, obviously, are sometimes considered interchangeable. There is a lot of overlap there, but there are some important distinctions to be made. So the term sex, again, used as the noun, speaks to biological differences, physical, physiological, anatomical differences. For instance, the most obvious, male and female genitalia, both internal and external, are different, observably so. Similarly, the levels and types of hormones present in male and female bodies are different, which subsequently leads to variations in other facets of the physiology as well. This is kind of irrefutable. If you talk to a biologist, if you talk to an anatomist, they will tell you, yes, there are differences between men and women, male bodies and female bodies. You can see those differences even down to the skeletal level. If you are talking to anthropologists, archaeologists, they will be forced to acknowledge that there are substantial differences that are demonstrable between male and female, even skeletons. So sex is defined by genetic components. Women have 46 chromosomes, including 2 X's. Men have 46, including an X and a Y. The Y chromosome being dominant. It carries the signal that basically triggers the embryo to begin forming testes and thus be a male embryo. These final chromosomes are delivered to the ovum by the sperm, by the way. There's a lot of misconception in many, many cultures, many of which are Muslim majority cultures, that if a woman doesn't have a son, which we shouldn't be worried about anyways, that it's somehow a flaw in her, when the reality is it is the father's semen, which is sperm, which is determining this by Allah's permission. Moving on. Obviously, there are some very rare, very, very, very vanishingly rare exceptions to this binary that we'll discuss later in the series. I don't say vanishingly rare to, erase the fact that these exceptions exist. On the contrary, I want to buck the trend that seems to be happening in modern discourse around sex and gender, where these rare exceptions are used as a scapegoat, are used as a red herring to manipulate the discussion rather than actually addressing their unique situations directly. And I don't want to do that. I don't feel that's correct. So we're not going to use those exceptional people as scapegoats and lump them in with the typical normal binary of the sexes. Now, Allah says in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم, O mankind, fear your Lord who created you from one soul and created from it its mate and dispersed from both of them many men and women. Fear Allah through whom you ask from one another and the wombs that bore you. And indeed, Allah is ever over you an observer. This is Surah An-Nisa, which is chapter 4, verse 1. And then Allah says in Surah Al-Hujurat, which is chapter 49, verse 13, O mankind, we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing and acquainted with all things. So we see, and this is just a couple examples of the distinct mention of two sexes, the male, the female. Some might argue, because people will argue anything to make a point in this discussion now, how do we know that this means anatomical differences, that this means two divergent types of anatomy, right? And not just two spirits or two brain types or what have you. Again, Allah tells us in the Quran, and this is chapter 13, verse 8, Allah knows what every female carries and what the wombs lose prematurely or exceed, and everything with him is by due measure. So here we have, again, one example of many where Allah specifies that this female to which he is referring is the one that carries a fetus in the womb. So, the female is the sex which has that potential of a womb and therefore pregnancy and childbirth, leaving the male obviously as the party with the potential for sperm and contributing that part to the process of procreation. So now let's look at the term gender. That's sex. Sex is the biological divergence. You have male, female bodies, physiological differences down to the chromosomal level. We are different, distinct forms of creation of humanity. Now let's look at the term gender. So this is a very polarizing word right now. This is one you will find defined with widely varying implications, depending on who you are talking to and what the discussion is about. This has become one of those words that can just kind of mean whatever you want it to mean. A general kind of neutral explanation would be gender tends to denote social and cultural roles of each sex within society. Then you obviously have more polarized versions. I was, just scrolling through various definitions from various sources, and the WHO, the World Health Organization of all organizations, their current definition defines gender as the socially constructed characteristics of men and women, such as norms, roles, and relationships of and between groups of men and women. It varies from society to society and can be changed. Obviously, the latter explanation of gender is not one that's in line with Islamic principles. Allah makes clear to us countless times in the Quran the distinction between men and women in the context of our roles in society. In an Islamic society, we were created as these two separate categories. We were conceived as these two separate categories, and our dunya rights and roles and responsibilities are varying in direct correlation to these two groups, male and female, man and woman. The examples of this are just way too many to list. Any verse that is discussing law, that isn't discussing basically how we move and exist in a society as Muslims, addresses these differences and the overlap where there are no differences. This is everything from how many animals you slaughter at the aqiqah when you have a child, if it's male or female, who receives the mahar and who gives it, who inherits more and is simultaneously required to spend more of their wealth, manner of dress, primary roles. It's extensive. These are all varied and defined specifically according to sex, and thus gender, meaning the role of each sex in society, are inextricably linked in Islam. There is no wiggle room here. There are many areas where men and women can both function equally, but there are many areas where we are distinct and separated in our rights, roles, and responsibilities. And again, that's just not something that's up for debate as far as just the Quran goes. There are very clear, distinct rulings that outline the fact that men and women serve different functions in certain aspects of society. Now, this isn't to ignore the reality that Muslim, non-Islamic cultures often dictate extremely oppressive boundaries around sex and use sex as an excuse to marginalize women specifically, far more often than not. Rather, this is another place where we need to be able to observe the way things exist outside Islam and acknowledge the reality of that, while still not losing sight of the edicts that Allah has given us that are still completely correct, completely clear, regardless of human weakness. This is, again, like when we were discussing the concept of feminism in general. And I mentioned how we can't disregard the role that feminism has played in white Western societies. And the fact that despite Islam giving us inalienable rights and designating responsibilities, we would not be guaranteed those in Western society, but thanks to the work done by Western feminists who have kind of paved the way to make room for Islamic women's rights to a certain degree. Not completely, unfortunately. I don't know of a single country on earth that is fully giving women the rights that Islam, that Allah has decreed for them to every degree, but perfection is for Jannah. So getting back on topic. Now my mouth is dry, so let me take a drink. So again, Allah recorded our sexes before our parents were even conceived, and thus assigned our gender to us before we were brought into existence. Allah says in the Quran, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim." Allah, surely nothing is hidden from him in the earth or in the heavens. He is it. He it is who shapes you in the wombs as he likes. There is no God but he, the mighty, the wise. This is Surah Al-Imran, verses 5 and 6, I believe. Also of note is that, again, even as an infant, Allah recognizes the very clear distinction between male and female. In Surah Al-Imran, which is chapter 3, verse 36, Allah says, "But when she delivered her, she said, 'My Lord, I have delivered a female.' And Allah was most knowing of what she delivered. And the male is not like the female. And I have named her Mary, and I seek refuge for her in you and for her descendants from Shaitan." So this is, there's a debate now about should we even have gender on birth certificates, because the modern discourse has led us to the absurd place where you will hear people say that they were assigned this gender at birth, right? Which technically, yes, the doctors, the physicians, your mother and father observed your sexual characteristics and thus from that extrapolated your gender. But again, this is kind of a reflection of the fact that in many modern cultures, being a woman, accepting that you are a woman means accepting a degree of oppression, which many people are finding problems with. So this is a weakness of non-Islamic culture, of not implementing Islamic law and Islamic rights and responsibilities. This is not our weakness. We have clearly defined roles, and we should not let Western flaws, and not even just Western, many Muslim majority nations struggle with the exact same issues, if not worse. But we should not let those flaws, those cultural flaws, dictate how we practice our Islam. So I'm recording Instagram as well as doing the Facebook and YouTube, and my Instagram is just about out of time. So let me post that up, and then I will continue. So we're just going to take like a brief pause here. Inshallah, I have volume. I think I've figured this thing out, but Restream is tricky sometimes. So, and we're a little more than halfway done, inshallah. Bismillah. Come on, phone. Internet has been slow today. My Wi-Fi is having a bit of a crisis. While I'm waiting for that, just a little behind the scenes. This series was prompted by several different conversations I've had recently around different things, around the concept of transgenderism, around the concepts of, the Western concepts of sexuality being kind of a deterministic thing, around sex ed for children. When do you implement these kind of discussions? How to deal with curiosity in children around different aspects of anatomy, things like that. And so rather than doing just a bunch of kind of haphazard talks touching on all of those things sporadically, I felt like, and discussed with Imam Shafi, that it seemed like the best way to approach it was to just do a series on the concepts of sex and gender, basically from the creation of Adam alayhi salam and Hawa, may Allah be pleased with them, and kind of correlate that to conception and go from there. This thing is gonna give me a hard time. So inshallah, this talk will just be more of an intro on our terms, so we can establish what these terms mean in the context of this series from this point forward. I'm sure some people will still have issue with it, but I can refer them back to this video, which is a nice thing to be able to do. Come on now. So if you have any suggestions on specific topics to touch on within the series, my my thinking has been to basically start with conception and then move to like birth and early infancy, because there's a lot of rulings around even an infant, a male infant versus a female infant that hasn't been weaned. Their urine has different degrees of how it should be dealt with to make the area pure. So just a lot of interesting things like that I want to touch on.
And I remember.
Okay, so got this thing uploaded. We get it back in the holder and we will continue, inshallah. That's crooked. Okay, again, back to Instagram. Assalamu alaikum. So moving on, to recap. Sex is a clearly defined thing in Islam. Sex, the noun, biological sex. The differences regarding expectations while in dunya are where gender comes in the Islamic context. And I do want to explore a little later on that in Arabic, in the Quran specifically, there's even some different terminology that's used to kind of relate to these two concepts. You have words that are used around the discussion of biology, just the simple nature of the male versus the female. And then there are different terms used in the social context. So that's really interesting as well. So let's look at the real question, that what this conversation comes back to in the modern context and in the historical context as well. Most people understand inherently that there are two sexes and two genders that correlate to them. The issue really comes down to the question of equality, right? Are these two sexes equal? Islam says definitely. If you define equality as holding the same inherent value, regardless of your sex, if you define it as both sexes and genders being equally entitled to their designated rights, equally bound by their designated responsibilities, then Allah absolutely considers us to be equal. Allah says in the Quran, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim." But those who do good, whether male or female, and have faith will enter paradise and will never be wronged even as much as the speck on a date stone. That's Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 124. And then the well-known verse, Surah Al-Ahzab, which is chapter 33, verse 35. Indeed, the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the obedient men and the obedient women, the truthful men and the truthful women, the patient men and the patient women, the humble men and the humble women, the charitable men and the charitable women, the fasting men and the fasting women, the men who guard their private parts and the women who do so, the men who remember Allah often and the women who do so. For them Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. This isn't conditional. If a woman performs her function in society, if she fulfills Allah's rights upon her, if she fulfills the rights of her community upon her, if she fulfills her responsibilities, she is completely equal with a man who does the same. There's no question about that in Islam. Any question around the inherent value of a human being being less or more than the other comes back to faith. But the reality is, Allah blessed all of humanity through the creation of us, through the giving of us the soul. And there's no contrary point to that can be made. Any point that's against that, that's trying to be made, is a false one. It's something cultural that's coming in, that's skewing, that's corrupting what Allah has actually said about the matter. So again, this is kind of the opening point for the series, and I felt the need to clearly establish our terms for the remainder of these talks. Biological sex exists, gender exists, and as far as Islam is concerned, is inextricable from biological sex. Women are females, men are males. There's just no way around that in the Islamic discourse. Now, many will ask, why would Allah create two sexes with different and sometimes disparate roles within society? Why not just make us identical in form and function, right? Allah says in the Quran in Surah Al-Araf, which is chapter 7, verse 189, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It is He who created you from one soul and created from it its mate, that he might dwell in tranquility with her. And again, back to Surah Hujurat, which is chapter 49, verse 13. O mankind, we have indeed created you from male and female, and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous. Indeed, Allah is knowing and acquainted. So Allah sees and knows all. And in His perfect wisdom, He created us as complements to one another, to fill each other's gaps, to support each other in our weaknesses, and to work together to form a functioning culture and society of humanity. Again, any distortion from that is us. That's our own weaknesses, and we'll certainly answer for it. But this isn't something that should be put on Islam. People will point to, I was watching a lecture from some Harvard panel discussing a book earlier today. I'll have to find the link for it. I don't know if I really want to share it. I don't know if it's worth reading, but they were discussing, the oppression of women in so many Muslim majority countries. And I think the Western perspective often fails to see its own oppression. It fails to see its own unique type of oppression of women. There's one group of men in the world who want women, covered and locked away inside and out of sight and silent. And there's another, regardless of the fact that women have a right to exist in the world. We're not shameful things inherently. We're not somehow dirty or corrupted. And there are degrees to which women should be allowed to move freely. That's unquestionable based on the Quran and the Sunnah. But then you have the other side of the world that wants us naked and on display for public consumption. And I have failed to see, since long before I was Muslim, what the difference is, honestly. Why is exploiting a woman publicly more acceptable than exploiting a woman privately? That's the real question I think we should be asking ourselves. And as someone who grew up in this Western culture and this perspective of modern feminism and sex-positive feminism, and was just never able to accept the ideology, I encourage all of my sisters to dig deeper, even when it's uncomfortable, to look at the aspects of the Quran that trouble you and really reflect on why. Is it because they're incorrect, or is it because you have accepted a view that was not intended for you? Is it because you've been told you have to sacrifice your fitra to be empowered? So that's, I think, all I have today. I feel like I maybe skipped something in my notes, but I think it was probably just me rambling. So inshallah, that's kind of the intro to sex and gender in Islam versus the Western kind of current concept of it. And the next, we will look at things like pregnancy, birth, and that early infancy period, and discuss the differences there, inshallah. So if you haven't already, like, subscribe, follow, whatever, for the respective platform you are watching on. Also consider donating. It's not complicated. You can go to paypal.me/Islamic Outreach CC. You can sign up to give $20 a month. Every little bit really helps. We're a small center, but we are working very hard to keep programs going and available and relevant to the community, to fill in the gaps that exist, where we felt like there are just not a lot of programs directed specifically at the Western Muslim audience, be it reverts or be it, second generation, children of immigrants who have come here from back home and are trying to struggle to embrace and accept and implement their Islam with all of this kind of indoctrination pouring in their head. So support us however you can. Inshallah, like, subscribe, share, and we will see you Saturday after next. Inshallah will be the next in this series. And as always, jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.